And a few minutes went by, and then the transmission started coming in. Okay, this thing is starting to move very strangely. It's not moving like an aircraft. It appears to be getting brighter and closer. I'm like, okay, so I start to get ready to go, grab my gear, and then within a few moments, all hell breaks loose.
In the 2003 timeframe, a large group of Boeing contractors were operating near one of the launch facilities at Vandenberg Air Force Base when they observed a very large 100-yard sided red square approach the base from the ocean and hover at low altitude over one of the launch facilities.
We've got 3 civilian Boeing contractors working on LF-21 and LF-10 on North Base, on the north end of the base. And they called in reporting this gigantic floating red square. You know, those 2 incidents, the red square and then the dark square, they were just sort of like random events that happened. Something flew over the area. Okay, there was a security response, we up-channeled it. But after that, we had a landing.
The following is a conversation with Jeff Nuccetelli. Jeff served just shy of 2 decades in the United States Air Force as a military police officer. He later joined the United States Marshal Service. Jeff shares with us his first-hand account of the 2003 Red Square UFO incident at Vandenberg Air Force Base, along with his personal experiences of UFOs and UAP. Jeff also recounts a glowing orb sighting in Japan from 1994 and other mysterious incidents at Vandenberg, including a landing. His candid witness accounts of these extraordinary cases and his credibility as a US Air Force law enforcement officer adds to his credibility, and it's also so valuable to speak to people who are actually there on the ground at the time. It also helps that Jeff is just a wonderful human being, a great conversationalist, and an all-round good guy, making it our absolute pleasure and honour to talk to him. And without further ado, the following is a conversation with Jeff Nuccetelli. Jeff, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us. If it's okay with you, I'd just like to sort of jump in and get a bit of an idea about where you kind of came from and perhaps your interest in this subject from an earlier age, if indeed you did have one. Where did it sort of start?
Yeah, so really it started early. I was always into sci-fi, science fiction, fantasy, that kind of thing when I was very young. But when I got a little bit older, my grandmother on my mother's side used to tell me about a UFO encounter her and my grandfather had in 1966. It was actually a pretty famous case. It was took place at Presque Isle in Lake Erie in Pennsylvania. So what had happened was my grandmother and grandfather were out there fishing on vacation. It's about an hour from Pittsburgh, so I grew up in the Pittsburgh area. And they were out there on a little fishing boat coming in to dock in the evening. It was getting dark. And they saw this craft fly in, like sort of a saucer-shaped object, metallic, no noise, and it flew in over the lake and landed right next to a lighthouse they have here. There's a state park and a lighthouse. And they watched it come down and they were like, you know, what is that? And my grandfather served in the Navy in World War II and saw heavy combat. He was in the Battle of Sicily and all the battles at the last end of the war. So he was very familiar with aircraft, and he had witnessed radio controlled bombs during the war and all kinds of different attacks by bombers. So he knew generally what was up there. He had no idea what it was. By the time they got in, it was dark, and my grandmother wanted to go and check it out, and he refused. They went back to the hotel. But first thing in the morning, she made him take her out there. And they found part of the beach had been turned to glass in an area. And allegedly, my grandmother collected some of that, and I'm still trying to track that down. And they found these depressions in the sand that were very deep, like 6 or 8 inches deep. And apparently there was a huge investigation. The local police were involved. There were witnesses from all over the area. And there were eyewitnesses that were there on the beach. A group of young, like teenagers were there, and they had gotten stuck in the sand. And the one young lady had actually witnessed the craft land. And according to them, some kind of like creature got out. And they had an encounter with this creature. It allegedly scratched their car and left hair on it was a hairy creature, like a Bigfoot. And it had left some hair on a tree. And there was a police investigation. It was in all the papers, national papers. The FBI was involved. The Air Force sent a team out to investigate. So it was a big deal. And then basically what happened with that case, my grandmother and grandfather only saw this object come in and land. And then, over the following days, it was all over the national news. So they only saw the craft land. But yeah, they took plaster casts of the impressions that this craft left. They checked for radiation. But the investigation was not very professional. And when I went back and looked at the case, they kind of just discounted everything as, they're teenagers making up stories. And, they said that it was probably a large raccoon or a bear that they had seen. And they didn't have an explanation for the marks that the craft had left. But yeah, it was another one of those big mass sightings. And the other thing interesting about that case was there was a journalist that was taking pictures on another location when it happened, and he caught an image of it. And they had published that in all the papers and reports, and it was a pentagon-shaped craft or object.
Wow.
So yeah, it started with that. Growing up, I would hear this from my grandmother. She would tell me that story. And so I was interested. And then my father actually saw the Kecksburg fireball. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but he was a young man outside. That happened in the area where I grew up too. I think Kecksburg is like 40 miles from my hometown. And he was outside and just saw the fireball. And then that turned into another whole story. So that's where it began with me. I had this sort of family lineage, and then I was interested, but I wasn't like obsessive about it. I wasn't like delving into the UFO lore very much until that came later after I had my own experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can we just talk about your role in the military? What did you do? And then perhaps work our way up to sort of 2003.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined the Air Force when I was 18. I grew up in a small coal mining town, and my sister had joined a year before. She was doing very well, so I joined. I picked the career field to be a security specialist. Back then, the police security career field was broken up into different parts. They had a law enforcement specialty, a security specialist, and then we had our K9 and combat arms and things. So I went in security, went through all my training, and then my first duty station was in Japan. I got stationed in Misawa, Japan, which is in the very northern part of Japan. So yeah, early training was security specialist. And then later when I went to Vandenberg, that was in 1999. So I was in Japan for almost 7 years. A lot of interesting things happened there. That's when things were hot with North Korea and things. So we were very active during that time. I spent a lot of time in Korea and around Asia. And then in 1999, I went to Vandenberg. And leading up to that, the career fields had combined. And then I started doing law enforcement work while I was in Japan. And then when I went to California, to Vandenberg, I got heavily involved in law enforcement. So at that base, we had a very robust law enforcement mission. The base is gigantic. It's like 36 miles of coastline, over 100,000 square acres of land. It's just huge. And we had a lot of roads and highways that had either joint jurisdiction with the state or we had exclusive jurisdiction. So we worked a lot with, California Highway Patrol and Santa Barbara County Sheriffs and all the different local police departments. And very active very busy base there with law enforcement. And then we had a very active security role. That Vandenberg was a primary test launch and launch installation. So we had big rocket launches all the time, very important launches. And we were responsible for, guarding all that and providing security. And so, yeah, that was pretty much my role. And then professionally, I kind of went through the whole security forces career field, from security specialist, I became a dispatcher and a law enforcement controller, and eventually a law enforcement patrolman, and then later a flight sergeant. I was running like a platoon of police officers, and then later I went to staff roles. Yeah, and that's kind of a summary. And then in 2003, the Vandenberg event started. So.
Don't want to put you in a situation if you're not prepared to talk about it, Jeff, but I understand you had a sighting in Japan in '93 that you've mentioned before, and I totally understand if you're not at a stage where you can come forward with that, but is there anything you can tell us?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to tell the story. This would have happened in 1993 or 94, probably 94, when I was relatively new. And I was a security patrol at the 3rd Space Tracking Site at Misawa. And that was another large area full of these big radome fields that have antennas inside. And they track objects in orbit and space trash and other things like that. And that particular area had the highest security classification that we have in the US government. So a highly classified, highly sensitive, critical mission there. So we had about 6 people stationed on that site to provide security. I was on the internal security patrol, so my job was just to drive around or walk around this area, keep it secure. And I had come up with my partner to the entry control point at the front of the area. And we were all in the back in the evening having a break, just talking. And we were facing, looking into the area. So our entry control point was behind us. We were all just standing there looking into the area. And we saw this blue orb, like the size of a basketball, just appear low to the ground, just blink. And then it arced through the air and vanished as it went near the ground again. And it was about 50, maybe 100 feet away. No obstruction. It's kind of just this big open, field with buildings and things in the distance. And we all looked at each other, and I was like, did you guys see that? And they're like, yeah, what was it? We had a discussion, and then we got worried that it might have been some kind of exercise or something that they were pulling on us to test us, because they used to do that like constantly. So I called it in. I called it in over the radio, and then it initiated this big armed response. It went out all over the net. They told everybody on duty that we had an alert. There was a response. We went out. We looked all over the area. We searched. We made sure everything was secure. Checked all the alarms, and then my boss came up and talked to all of us about what we saw, and we were like, maybe it was a flare. But I knew when I had called it in and I had said it was possibly a flare, like as soon as that came out of my mouth, my brain was like, that was not a flare. It was just something completely out of the ordinary. And then that happened. And then, people kept talking. I kept talking about that to people, like, what happened at work? And my friend, Ryan, his name was Ryan Tyra. He worked with me. He was from Hawaii. He had grown up in Hawaii. And he said, oh man, that's an orb. He said, they're all over Hawaii. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he gave me this book. I think it was something like The Orbs of Hawaii. And he let me borrow it. And it was just all these black and white photos of these orbs. And they were talking about what they are. And they had, this long tradition in Hawaii about these orbs. So that's when I first found out that there may or may not be something like that. So, yeah.
Fascinating. And Jim, I don't want you to give away anything that you're not supposed to, but at that base at that time, was there any kind of nuclear capable stuff? Because that seems to be something with Malmstrom where the orb phenomena is seen a lot.
Yeah, Japan, the strategic treaty we have with Japan prohibits any kind of nukes in Japan whatsoever. They have a very stringent agreement. We couldn't even run like traditional bombing attacks from Japan. We would have to fly to Guam or somewhere else and then to the Middle East or wherever to do it. So no, there were no nukes there, but we had extremely high level resources there that are equivalent in protection to nukes. So look, the most critical assets we have.
What's it like being a police officer for, is your jurisdiction just purely the military personnel? So obviously security of the site, but is that, you know, are you dealing with sort of domestic violence situations? Are you dealing with thefts and things like that? What's it like kind of having jurisdiction over a military base? We sort of
It's a wild adventure. You get all the same things you would get in an average population. You get all the most horrific things that can happen, and all kind of beautiful things too. So yeah, we dealt with some of the most heinous crimes that occur. We dealt with just random accidents. You would just see terrible things happen to people sometimes, and also a lot of good. But we were at Vandenberg was very different. We have, to answer your question, yeah, we typically only have jurisdiction over military personnel, and there's a whole body of law that just covers strictly that. But depending on the jurisdiction you're in, you might have some jurisdiction with civilians. So at Vandenberg, we had concurrent and joint jurisdictions with the state, and we had agreements set up so that we could actually arrest civilians on the highway, and then we would cite them into a federal court. So if we got a civilian DUI on the highway, we would process them using, it was called the Assimilative Crimes Act, where they allowed us to assimilate state or federal law and then prosecute for a state crime in federal court. So yeah, we had a lot of interactions with civilians because of the highway, and that region is a major route for drugs, human trafficking, and everything good and bad heading northwest, or I'm sorry, north south in California. So we had a lot of interactions with some interesting people.
Yeah, I can imagine some stories to tell over that period of time. And yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's jump into this incident from 2003. Can you kind of talk us through how that started and sort of the start of your day?
Yeah, so about that time, so the war had started in 2001, so we had a extremely heavy deployment tasking at Vandenberg. So we were constantly deploying, coming back. And then we got extremely busy because of the war with the launches and everything, right? So by this point, we had been, working nonstop for a few years, and we're pretty exhausted. But I remember coming into work that day. It was October 14th, 2003. I came in for a mid shift. I was relieving Delta flight. They had worked a day shift. We worked in 12-hour shifts that were actually like 14 or 16-hour shifts, but you were on duty technically for 12 hours. And I had come in about an hour early to do changeover with the off-going leadership. So I rolled in and I saw that there was a kind of group of 10, maybe 12 people at the smoke pit across from our armory. And I knew something was up as I pulled in because they all saw me. They started to point at my, there's Jeff. They had something to tell me. So I parked and walked over, and all at once they start telling me that they had this real world UFO encounter that happened at LF-21 that morning. So very quickly, I established that they're not playing a prank. They're not messing with me. It's not a joke. And they're telling me, dude, head over to the command center and get the full story. So I do that. I walk over. I meet with the off-going people. And they start to tell me the story. So at 08:45, the dispatcher on our command center received a phone call from range control. Range control is a big command center for all the dispersed launch areas. Range control calls us, an active duty member from range control calls us and says that we've got 3 civilian Boeing contractors working on LF-21 and LF-10 on North Base, on the north end of the base. And they called in reporting this gigantic floating red square hovering with no sound, making no noise at low altitude over the launch pad. And they called it into range control. Range control called around to various other command centers. They called the weather station. They called the radar stations. They called everybody that they could think to see if they had any weather balloons or anything going on. After they made those calls, they were all negative, nothing on radar, nothing in the air. They tried to call those contractors back to check on their status, and they were unable to get a hold of them because they were doing maintenance. There was maintenance in progress. And then they called the police and said, here's what we got going on. Here's what was reported. Here's what we've done. And that's how we got involved. So my buddies on Delta flight drove out to the site. They met with the contractors. They conducted a preliminary investigation. They talked to everyone, and they had them write sworn written statements. This is what we've seen. They took all the data. Those patrolmen didn't see anything on the way they were back. And then they came back. They typed up the blotter. So the blotter is a chronological, record of everything that happens on a shift. So a blotter will run 24 hours. It'll start at like 0500 from Delta flight when they come on duty. It'll run to 5 p.m. Then we come on duty. Then we'll take it up and run it for 24 hours. So they recorded all the information in the blotter, and then they notified everybody in our chain of command and command post and various other agencies. They notified Air Force Office of Special Investigations and on and on. So they made official notifications, and that was up-channeled to headquarters. And then later they had the technical sergeant that had called in the initial complaint. They had him come in later that afternoon, and he wrote a sworn written statement saying, this is what they told me, this is what I did. And I'm lucky enough, I have that blotter entry, actually 2 pages of the blotter from that day, and one of the witness statements, the technical sergeant that called in from range control. So I still have those in my possession. So yeah, that's what I was briefed when I came on duty.
Wow.
Pretty wild,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your first thought is they're winding me up. This is some sort of prank, notorious in the military and the police, I guess, for pranking each other. And then you realize this is some serious stuff. Right. Was there like a consensus from the witnesses and the information is going around? Were there any differences in, for example, the shape and the size and the look, or was it pretty, generally pretty much a consensus on sort of shape and size and characteristics?
From that original event, the issue is I have lost the other associated statements, right? So I can only recollect what I used to read. I know, or I remember that witness number 1 had the most detailed statement. He was the one that first observed it. From what I can remember, he picked up the landline and called the other 2 contractors in the other building and said, hey, come out here and look. And he had the most descriptive statement. I can't remember for certain if he had additional detail or, so I only have the description that was relayed to him via telephone that the technical sergeant wrote about, and the description that they contained in the blog. So, and that was basically just, it was a large 100-yard square floating object with no noise. All that data is captured, but not a lot of detail.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that it approached in the morning? It approached from overland.
From what I remember, I believe it either he just walked out and noticed it over him, or it drifted in from the ocean. But I know that when it left, it drifted east onto the base over the hills. We have that on record. It floated gently. It didn't shoot off. It gently just floated away onto the installation.
And because I've heard you describe the object itself, but I'm really interested in what sort of access to like radar data or air traffic control, or if there's any other sort of data that you might have been able to get access to, or at least know that exists.
Yeah, with that case, no, because the initial reports had been that there was nothing on radar or anything like that. And in my role, I typically wouldn't have had that access to that information, even if it had been available. Yeah, they wouldn't have provided that to me, probably.
Yeah. So there was another incident later the same day, is that right? So the same evening, later that evening, sorry.
Yeah, so we get this story, and we all come on shift, and it's briefed in our guard mount. You know, our boss comes out and tells us, here's what happened in the previous shift, and a UFO. So everybody was, pretty excited. Some people didn't believe it. Some people, just couldn't wait to get on duty, and I was one of those. So yeah, we went on duty. I went and grabbed all the imaging equipment I could get. I got thermals, NVGs, I got some binocs, and me and a bunch of my buddies went out looking for UFOs that day. So sometime around evening, I was out on the beach by myself, out looking for these things with the NVGs, and then I got a little bit nervous being out there on my own, thinking, what if it shows up and I'm alone here? So I went back into the command center, and we think this happened around midnight. So I got back to the command center. I was up there with a few of my friends, including my friend Brandon, that was the dispatcher that night. And all of a sudden, a transmission came in from our security patrol at Slick 4, at Space Launch Facility 4. Now that's located at the opposite end of the base. So the transmission comes in that something to the effect that there's a strange light over the Western Ocean, moving erratically. So the dispatcher tells them, be advised, keep visual on it. Let us know if anything happens. And a few minutes went by, and then the transmission started coming in. Okay, this thing is starting to move very strangely. It's not moving like an aircraft. It appears to be getting brighter and closer. I'm like, okay, so I start to get ready to go, grab my gear, and then within a few moments, all hell breaks loose. And the patrol starts coming in. They're yelling. The thing is coming right at us. It's coming right for us. Now it's right here. And just like I said, all hell broke loose, and everybody, we had different people from different areas in that location calling in, reporting it. Multiple people were trying to break into the net to report what they were seeing. And my friend started to provide command and control and advise post what to do. I jumped in my car and I took off and headed out there. And by the time I got there, the object had shot off. I remember hearing that. And then things kind of calmed down. So I arrived on scene to the entry control point, and everybody was waiting for me. And I talked to everybody. And basically what they described was they were all together at the entry control point when it arrived, because they had heard, the patrol had called in the weird light, and they all kind of congregated to watch it. And basically they were watching this thing flutter around in the night sky very strangely for a while. And then it very rapidly just shot in. It just approached at high speed, and the light got huge and big and bright. And then as it got right up on top of them, the light went out, and they could just see this huge square or rectangle shape, black mat, hovering maybe 200 to 500 feet above the ground, and maybe about 100 to 300 yards away. It just stopped. And it was so big, it just appeared like it was over everybody. And they watched this thing. They all stood there together for about 45 seconds. And then it shot off and just disappeared. So,
Wow.
yeah, I talked to everybody in a group. I talked to everybody separately. I had everybody write statements. And then our boss came out, my flight chief came out. He talked to everybody. And then we did the same thing. We collected all the information. We typed up a report. We put it in the blotter. We made all the notifications up the chain of command. And then we just went back on duty, you know.
Jesus. What are you thinking? I mean, this happens, right? I mean, I'm trying to put myself in this position. I'm there. This crazy stuff happens on a night shift. I'm working. My friends, my buddies, my colleagues are working as well. This happens. You have like I don't know, a tea break or a smoke break or whatever you do when you have 5 minutes to yourself. What is going through your head at this point? Like, what do you how do you process that?
You can't. It's like you're in a movie. You feel like you're in a movie. You feel like you're in a Twilight Zone. You can't believe it's actually happening, and you can't believe it's actually real. And you keep looking around at all your friends and your boss, and you're like, and it keeps like hitting you like a wave. Like, this is actually happening, and it's very difficult to process. But for me, it was like it was like the biggest thing ever. It's like I'm getting disclosure in real time. Like I'm like everything my grandmother said, you know, is real. And all these other stories we've all heard about could be real, right? So it was a lot of mixed emotion, mostly excitement and awe and elation. But there was also some fear, you know, because I just gone through this, like I'm driving out there at maximum speed running code, and I'm listening to my buddy screaming about a UFO, you know, right over top of it. So it was really wild. It was hard to process. But the good thing was in every case, there were always multiple witnesses.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, well, the one contractor, you know, 35 miles up on North Base saw a weird light. It was like 3 guys with top secret clearances saw it in broad daylight. They're not drunk, they're not crazy. And then it keeps happening, right? So it gets more and more real as it's happening. And then I just remember also being bummed out because I didn't see it. Because on the way out there, I'm driving, trying not to crash my car and looking.
Yeah. I
So
can
yeah,
imagine. I can imagine.
yeah.
With all the chaos in your ears and vivid images. Yeah, crazy. So I mean, I'm obviously as an outsider. When you think about a case like this, you think, okay, well, how could we research it? You know, what would be a good way for us to try and dig in? And I've seen you talking before about the sort of retention of documents. I know that you had some copies, and some of those were destroyed in a flood. But in terms of officially via the government, I know there was issues with DoD's retention of documents not being very good in the past, and since improving a bit. But then we think that there's likely to be kind of overhead sensors and stuff that potentially pick up different bits and pieces. As a researcher and people out there that look at things like FOIA, and just, is there anything that you can think of where we could kind of dig into this from a different angle, or we could kind of direct our energy to trying to get more information out officially about a case like this? I mean, or is that something that you've worked on over the years or looked into?
Yeah, I have worked on it a bit. The issue is, so as far as sensor data, Vandenberg had multiple agencies working there, and they had hyper advanced sensor systems. But there's no way to access that if they even picked up anything, because with many of the historical cases, there will be nothing on radar. But even going back to some of the cases in the 50s, they've got nothing on radar from the local airport, but the military radars are picking up contacts, right? So we've got different technology levels, even back in the 50s, where military could find things that civilian radars couldn't. And then in that case, there was no radar, and that was a military grade radar, at least with the initial event. So if they picked up any other kind of sensor data, there's really no practical way for a civilian researcher to access. That's gone dark. The other issue is there should be a historical record of basically everything that happened on that base. So those blotters I was talking about, those are the best historical record that can tell you day to day every single thing that happened on a base, even if it's not related to law enforcement, like a natural disaster, an accident, a broken like gas line. All of that information's retained in the blotter. All of that is gone. So I've received verification. A good friend of mine that is a researcher put in a FOIA request for my case to get all the data. It's all been destroyed legally. I don't know if they changed the records retention. And this is what I'm really having a hard time getting my mind around what they're doing. They're destroying all the military police documents after 3 years or 5 years, which doesn't make any sense for a variety of different reasons. Number one, because now there's no way for a historian or a researcher or an academic or anybody to go and write a book about what happened at Vandenberg.
Yeah.
Or do any kind of research, right? There's just, everything is gone. And the other thing about that is, like, we worked on cases where people got 20, 25, 30 years in prison, right? They were court-martialed, convicted. And if the government is destroying all those records after 3, 5, or 7 years, what happens if somebody's trying to get like a new trial, or they're trying, maybe there's a lawsuit, maybe they got hit by a drunk driver 12 years ago and it's finally playing out, and their lawyer's like, well, we need to get the records from the crash, and the government's like, there's nothing. We have destroyed all documents, right? So that is the issue. Like, they've made it impossible or near impossible for anyone to do historical research. And I don't know what to do about that. That's a conversation that needs to be happening in Congress. It needs to be, like, I don't know why journalists aren't talking about this. Like, people are asking for verification. It's like, if the government just hits delete every month.
That's madness. It's just madness.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, right? So what can be done? We had, and my friend Grant, who was a witness, remembers in detail, we had multiple occasions where Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department would call us and say, hey man, whatever you guys are doing, let us know. You're crashing our 911 network because we're getting hundreds of UFO calls. And we were like, it's not us, man. We're not launching, we're not flying. And then we would get them too. So we would have Santa Barbara County Sheriff calling, like, what's flying all over the Central Coast? And we would be getting calls too. So some of that data might be available in police records, civilian departments in Lompoc and Santa Maria and the whole Central Coast. So that's an avenue. But as far as the Fed, they're just shredding. They're shredding.
Crazy.
Seems like a bit of push-pull, because July 26th, the congressional hearing, all of a sudden, boom, there's Ryan Graves asked about it in front of Congress. So just talk us through how that must have felt. I mean, was that vindicating? Was that kind of stressful for you? And how did that come about?
Yeah, so I've been sitting on that documentation for 20 something years, right? And I used to have the whole file. And I would go through periods where, like, I felt like compelled, like, I need to get this out, because I would see people telling stories, right? Military people, civilians. And I would see, you know, all the pushback and the stigma attached to it. And I'm thinking, I would get really angry. I'm like, there is definitely something to these stories, right? So there were multiple times throughout my life where I'm like, I need to get this to someone, but I didn't know who. You know, there was MUFON, and then there were like Coast to Coast AM radio back in the day, and George Norrie and things, but I'm like, you know, I didn't know where it would go. And then a lot of the documents I had were for official use only, or they had protective information like social security numbers. So it's like, I'm not just going to hand that over, right? So I didn't know what to do. And then about a year leading up to the hearing, I really started to reach out to some people in the community, people that I started to watch and respect, like, hey, I've got some information. But I never got any feedback. And then I found Merged, and then I started to see things were actually rolling, you know. And basically, I looked up Ryan Graves. I checked out the organization. I tried to do some due diligence, and then I figured this is my best shot. This guy seems legit, you know. And yeah, so I reached out. I sent an email. And within a few days, he got right back to me, Americans for Safe Aerospace. And so Ryan Graves and his partner, Brad Crispin, reached out to me. We got on a video call. I told them who I was. I sent them all my, you know, performance reports and my 214. I'm like, here's who I am. You can verify all that. And after we talked and established trust, I gave them redacted versions of those documents. And that really got the ball rolling. And then they set up calls with some lawmakers and their staff members, and I gave them a briefing with a large number of people who were interested in the government. And I gave this sort of mass briefing, and then I provided Congress with the unredacted versions. Like, here you go. And then they coordinated me getting together with Arrow. I met with Arrow, same thing, and that went pretty well. And then I was just sort of in a holding pattern because before I had done all this without talking to any of the other witnesses. I hadn't talked to some of these guys since Vandenberg, like 20 years ago. And we were all really tight back then. We were very close, but we had like lost touch with one another. And then I was watching the hearing, and for me, it was a huge deal. It was like watching the Super Bowl. I had a beer, like I took the day off, I think, and was watching it, you know, and cheering and clapping and woohoo. And then that dropped, and I literally fell out of my chair. Like, I put my beer down, and I was like, "Oh my God, what is happening?" And yeah, it was crazy because I was trying to roll everything out in a very controlled manner because I was terrified about going public with this. I'm extremely private. I had really no social media presence. I had never been on Twitter until July, right before the hearing. And I wanted to contact more witnesses and see if they had more documentation. And I wanted to really get a lot of people in evidence and then go to Congress and Arrow and be like, here's the whole enchilada. And then it just came out in the hearing. And I was like, well, okay, man, here we go. And so it was elation and a little bit of fear. But in the end, I was like, so happy because that's what I was trying to do. I wanted to get the story out to the public with evidence saying, you know, this is happening all over the world. People are not lying. And I was hoping more and more military people would start just pouring in because I know many, many stories that people have shared with me during my career and after about similar things happening. And these are credible people. These are people I know and trust and have worked with and are extremely professional. And they're afraid to come out. So I'm hoping that more and more people will come out, and that was the whole thing. So it was a huge deal.
If you don't mind, then, because there's a lot of conjecture about Arrow, and they're in on the tip of everybody's tongue. So you said it was a positive experience. Can you just talk us through literally what they wanted to know, if they had any external data, because they'd have access to the full sensor arrays and anything that they wanted to see, and just sort of what your experience was like.
Yeah, so it was overwhelmingly positive. I spoke with one investigator. We talked for close to 2 hours probably, and we built some rapport. We actually knew some of the same people and things like that while we were in. And yeah, I shared the documents with them. I gave them a write-up of the other incidents that happened in October. There were multiple incursions in October 2003. I gave them information on an event that happened with me in 2005 at Vandenberg. And then we agreed to collaborate. And then they told me basically everything they were going to do to try to dig up data. The issue is there's always a problem with historical data. Is it retained? So even if Vandenberg had captured it, did they retain it? And if they retained it, can it be found? Right. So that's an issue. And then they had already, Arrow was the one that told me on the call about this data retention problem in DOD. And they went into great length about that. Like, we're having trouble finding police reports and blotters and statements that are gone. And that's DOD wide. So they let me know that ahead of time. Like, there's probably nothing left. They've cleaned out everything, shredded it, deleted it. So he was going to go and look for physical files at Vandenberg, check all the digital archives that he has access to. He told me that they would check into SAP special access programs, and they've done that. And they reported back to me that what we encountered at Vandenberg was not part of any SAP program. So they verified that. What we saw was not us playing, a game. And that's really all they can do. And they let me know that they're probably not going to be looking at historical cases that don't have data, because there's nothing to look at.
Yeah.
You'd imagine, though, that would make it into the Arrow report when they've got an anomalous sighting which is unresolved over one of the most important strategic missile defense bases in the US.
Right.
You'd think it would be worthy of further conversation.
It might be in the historical report part 2 coming out. I'm not sure, or it might remain unresolved.
It's difficult, isn't it? I think the common belief would be from people that are on the outside, kind of looking in and kind of speculating, that if you've got sensor data, if you've got sort of secretive data, classified data relating to something extraordinary, you'd retain that in a different way than you'd retain all the other sort of documents, the day-to-day stuff that, your CCTV from things that are not that important. Whereas this, incredibly unique, profound event, that would go somewhere different. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thought process, I think, for a lot of people. So it's kind of hard to believe that they haven't got it somewhere, just right. Some sort of special safe, a bit like, Ministry of Defense. I know that sort of Nick Pope, that if you know of Nick Pope, but he was kind of the X-Files guy, I guess, from the Ministry of Defense. So it would kind of go to their office. That's my understanding anyway. So it's somewhere different, and some equivalent version of that in the US Air Force or DOD, wherever it would go, there would be somewhere, some sort of central hub where I guess it's that potential foreign adversary as well as something weird, some kind of phenomenon in the same kind of bucket. But I don't know. I mean, we're speculating.
Yeah, and I'd say it's more likely than not that all these reports were aggregated somewhere at headquarters, because like, those 2 incidents, the red square and then the dark square, they were just sort of like random events that happened. Something flew over the area. Okay, there was a security response. We up-channeled it. But after that, we had a landing at Vandenberg. And that was logged as an unannounced aircraft arrival. And that's serious. I mean, that goes all the way up to higher headquarters, because you cannot have unknowns landing on your airbase, right? It just cannot happen. So I can't imagine that the Air Force would just be like, oh, okay, we got random unknowns flying over the National Missile Defense Project system, you know.
Yeah.
Is that the case from 2005 that you'd mentioned previously?
No, the landing happened within the same time frame. We know it happened between the 14th of October and the 31st of October, because the witness deployed to Iraq on Halloween. So we know it happened in that 2-week period. And again, 2 witnesses, same type of thing. They see a strange light. They were on patrol near the flight line. The flight line was shut down for the evening. No one on duty, no planes inbound. And we know about all that. The cops know everything inbound. We know what's on the flight line, where it's parked. We know all the air traffic. So nothing coming in, flight line shut down, no lights. And they observed this strange light fluttering around over the ocean. Again, it comes in strangely, they call it in, and then it zooms in, appears to land, and then as soon as it was there, it shoots off the parts, ends up like a star. And again, triggers a huge response, an investigation. They get there, there's nothing there. And then that's when the tone changed at Vandenberg. That witness and his partner were called in and debriefed, and they were made to feel very uncomfortable after that incident. And they were forced to sign documents. And that's probably because it was logged as an unannounced aircraft arrival. And that's very serious. So the tone changed on that account. So yeah, within this like 1-month period, there was a lot that happened.
When you've experienced something like this and you've spoken to your friends and you've had this from a young age, from relatives who you trust, and then this happens, you know, a couple of occasions, 3 occasions that you're aware of, do you feel like you need a sense of sort of validation, official validation from the government? Do you have this kind of feeling within you that, look, I need somebody official to say to me that you're not going mad, or, you know, you and your friends haven't seen something, you just didn't understand, it was, you know, foreign adversary, it was us, but we can't? Because for me, it would feel as if I would need some sort of official, you know, yes, you're not going mad. Yes, you and your friends aren't going mad. This is real, and we're going to look into it, and we're going to figure it out. Did you get that sense of almost like a need for some form of validation, or do you just, I don't need it? Where are you on that scale?
A little bit. The validation came from witnessing.
Yeah.
So after seeing it with my own eyes, and that's the event I'm referring to in 2005. And even when it happened with the Red Square and the other one in the landing, I didn't so much like, the validation was there, like in the moment, like this is validation, right? It's disclosure in real time. So, but I still do have that need. I want the government to just tell us like it's real. And they've acknowledged that things are flying around. We don't know what they are. But then there's all this disinformation muddling up the story. They'll admit, but then it's like, what is it?
Yeah, but you say that though. I mean, you look at Sean Kirkpatrick has done a lot of interviews, and I've watched all of them, and it's sort of whilst he was director, it seems as if he was saying, look, there's something unusual, there is something strange. What it is exactly, we don't quite know, and we're going to find out. And then sort of towards the end and around the time he left, and certainly afterwards, it's been very much, there is nothing to this, it's just misidentified things. And I'm like, well, hang on a minute, you know, John Kirby came out at the White House and said, the phenomena is real. You know, it is real. That's why we've got this set up. And the presidents have said, you know, there is stuff that's real. And then it's like, well, here's the guy that's supposed to be in charge of the team to investigate, and he said it's not really real. You're just misidentifying balloons and drones, and which one is it?
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing. That's the frustration with the government. Like when anyone that researches this topic, the playbook has not changed. It has not changed over time, right? There's these public acknowledgments like, yes, something weird is going on, and then the debunking, and and that's what happened with my grandmother's case. They just said these people just don't know what they're doing, and that was good enough to debunk the whole case. And that's what's happening now. The playbook is not changing, and that's where the frustration lies. And that's why I want to encourage more people like me, whether you have evidence or not. Like, there is strength in numbers. The more of us that come out, the more that they're going to have to acknowledge at some point that, yeah, there's things going on and we don't know what they are. And that's a problem, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Can I just ask one? I'm conscious of your time. If you could go, it's a bit of a left field question, really, but if you could go back in time to sort of 2003 and give yourself a message, and I'm thinking of this kind of for the benefit of hindsight for people now that perhaps witness things that are in the military and the Air Force, perhaps recently or today even. If there was almost a message that you could give to them to help progress this forward, because I'm sure that this is still happening, and I'm sure that there are people who are in your position or were in your position back in 2003 and the other times, but they're in that now. What could they do to put themselves into a better position to kind of push this forward, do you think? And it's a bit of a weird question, but if you could speak to your younger self, what advice would you give?
I would give the same advice that I've given to other people that have experienced the phenomenon, which is, first of all, really think deeply about what your motivation is for disclosing, right? For going public. And I had to do a lot of thinking about that. Like, what is my goal here? And you also need to really think about who you're comfortable sharing things with, good news and bad news, right? You have to have people around you that you can really trust if you're going to wade into this. Because when you wade into this, when you acknowledge that you've seen a UAP or a UFO or something like that, you're immediately entering the realm of witches and goblins and magic and Bigfoot and everything else. It's all jumbled together. And you need to be prepared for that, right? Because it can have real world impacts on your social circles and your work. And so you need to really consider that. And I did a lot of that. And I would advise that people, it was easier for me because I had people that I knew and I trusted, and they had their hand on my shoulder. And I knew that if the whole world turned on me and everybody said, you're just a lunatic, you're making this up, you forged everything, I still had people that I trusted and cared that knew I was telling the truth with their hand on my shoulder. It's like, we got you, you're good. Even if the whole world is against you, I got a little bubble of safety. And beyond that, it's like, it depends on what you're comfortable talking about. Because my experiences are relatively like mundane, compared to other people's events. So you have to really think about it. Like, how much do you want to share? Right. There's a lot to share. There's a lot of things that I don't share, other cases that I'm aware of that, because I'm very cognizant of sounding like a lunatic, because especially when you get to know more people. Like, I've had a lot of civilians and military people approach me since this whole thing came out in last July, and they've shared their own stories, and some of them are crazy, but I believe them because I know the person and I trust them. So if you are going to share, think about how much you want to share. There is a thing called oversharing. So yeah, and just try to be honest and sincere, and have support if you're going to do it.
Great advice. Great advice.
Just wanted to say before you go, Jeff, just in support of your grandparents. So weirdly, because I'm a big nerd, I've been looking into plasmas and things like that lately. And there's a condition called fulgurites when plasma hits sand and it turns it into glass. So when I heard about your grandparents' sighting, I was like, oh my God, it's some sort of plasma on this craft. And because that's a really new thing that people are talking about, is like these old, maybe some form of plasma, or when you see the glowing lights, that it's a plasma induced anti-gravity, and there's all these, it's a very modern thing. So I'm sure at that time when their case was investigated, that perhaps wouldn't have been part of the discussion, but I just wanted to mention it before you went.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing, when I went through all the documents from that case, I didn't find any other mention of the glass, and that was just, you know, my grandmother's detail. So who knows?
Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, look, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate this. It's been great talking to you. Firstly, I mean, thank you for your service. I really, you know, really genuinely, both to the UFO community, UAP community, but you know, more so your service to the country and the military. I can imagine that it's a completely different life to that we're used to.
It's an adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bet you got some stories, some crazy stories as well.
Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it, and the work you're doing. Your work is amazing, and keep doing what you're doing, and keep producing and sharing, because things are unraveling quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Jeff. Well, look, take care of yourself, and fingers crossed we'll stay in touch and hope to speak again soon in the future.
Great. All right. Take care, guys. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.